The auction happened on a Thursday afternoon in the town square of Redemption Springs, and it wasn't called an auction because that would have been too honest, too brutal, too clear about what was actually happening. They called it a charity social, a fundraiser for the new church roof, a community event where eligible bachelors could bid on picnic baskets prepared by the unmarried ladies of the town, and the highest bidder would win the honor of sharing lunch with the lady who'd prepared it. Perfectly innocent, perfectly civilized, perfectly acceptable by the standards of 1885 frontier propriety. Except everyone in Redemption Springs understood what was really being auctioned, and it wasn't picnic baskets. It was Emma Hartley. 23 years old, educated back east, beautiful enough to stop conversation when she entered a room, and completely, utterly trapped. Redemption Springs. In the spring of 1885, sat in the Montana Territory high country, where copper had been discovered 3 years earlier, and money had followed in quantities that transformed sleepy settlements into boom towns practically overnight. It was a young town, raw in some ways, but already showing the bones of permanence, with a bank building of actual brick and a hotel with a dining room that served food on china plates and an opera house under construction that would seat 300 when finished. The money came from copper, but it concentrated in the hands of maybe a dozen men who'd gotten there first, or gotten there smart, or gotten there ruthless. And those men ran Redemption Springs the way copper barons ran territory, with the absolute certainty that wealth equaled authority, and authority equaled the right to have whatever they wanted. What 3 of them wanted was Emma Hartley, and what made the situation particularly cruel was that Emma's father, Robert Hartley, had been one of them until 6 months ago, when a mining investment went catastrophically wrong and wiped out everything he'd built in 3 years of brutal work. Robert had gone from copper baron to debtor practically overnight, from member of the elite to man who owed money to men he'd once called equals. And the debt was specific and substantial, $23,000 owed to the Redemption Springs Mining Consortium, which was just a formal name for the 3 men who actually controlled the copper operations. Marcus Webb, who ran the smelting operations. Clayton Rhodes, who controlled the largest mining claims. And Silas Kane, who'd bought up the mineral rights to half the valley before anyone else understood what they were worth. The same 3 men who were now bidding on Emma's picnic basket, with the understanding that the winner wouldn't just get lunch. He'd get Robert Hartley's debt forgiven and Emma Hartley's hand in marriage as part of the package. Emma had known this was coming. Her father had told her 2 weeks ago, sitting in what was left of their house after they'd sold the furniture to pay immediate debts, that he'd made arrangements, that Webb and Rhodes and Kane had agreed to a solution that would clear the debt and secure Emma's future, that one of them would marry her, and which one would be determined by the auction, and she should understand that this was actually generous of them, that they could have simply taken everything and left the Hartleys with nothing. That marriage to any of the 3 wealthiest men in Redemption Springs was an opportunity most frontier girls would kill for. Robert had said all of this while not quite meeting Emma's eyes, while his voice had carried the particular shame of a father who'd failed to protect his daughter and was now rationalizing why selling her was actually kindness. Emma had spent those 2 weeks doing her own arithmetic. Webb was 51, twice widowed, with hands that shook from too much whiskey and a reputation for temper that his money usually smoothed over. Rhodes was 46, never married, with a house on the hill that looked out over the valley, and a coldness in his eyes that suggested he saw people as assets to be acquired and managed. Kane was 38, closest to Emma's age, educated and smooth, and the most dangerous of the three because he hid his cruelty behind charm and made you think partnership was possible right up until you discovered it wasn't. All three were offering her father's debt forgiven in exchange for her hand. All three were treating her like property being transferred between ledgers. All three were so certain this was how the world worked that they'd made it a public spectacle, a charity event, entertainment for Redemption Springs society. The stranger had arrived in Redemption Springs that morning, riding a sorrel horse through the spring mud, wearing a long coat that had seen weather, and carrying himself with the quiet that made people notice him by not noticing him. He tied his horse outside the livery, paid for boarding, and walked into town like he had business there, even though nobody recognized him, and nobody could figure out what that business might be. He'd spent the morning at the land office examining claim records, spent early afternoon at the assayer's office asking questions about mineral rights and valuations. By the time the charity social started at 2 o'clock in the town square, he'd been in Redemption Springs less than 6 hours and already understood exactly how the town worked and who made it work that way. The auction had started with the younger girls, the ones whose baskets were actually about baskets, where farmhands bid $2 and won lunch with the blacksmith's daughter, and everyone clapped because it was sweet and innocent and exactly what charity socials were supposed to be. But as the afternoon progressed and they worked through the unmarried ladies of Redemption Springs, the crowd's energy had changed, anticipation building, because everyone knew what was coming. When the auctioneer, a nervous man named Porter, who worked at Webb's smelting operation and understood exactly what he was being paid to facilitate, finally held up Emma Hartley's basket, the town square went silent in the particular way crowds go silent when they're about to witness something they'll talk about for years. The bidding had started at $100, which was already obscene for a picnic basket, already a statement about what was really being purchased. Webb had bid first, his voice carrying across the square with the confidence of a man who'd bought everything else he wanted in Redemption Springs. Rhodes had countered immediately, not to be outdone, not to let Webb think this would be easy. Kane had joined at 300, his smooth voice making it sound like he was doing everyone a favor by participating. The bidding had climbed past 500, past 1,000, numbers that made the watching crowd gasp, because that was more money than most of them would see in a year, and it was being thrown around for a basket, and everyone knew the basket wasn't the point. Emma had stood on the platform beside the auctioneer, wearing her best dress because her father had insisted she look the part. Her face composed in the way women learn to compose their faces when they're enduring something they can't stop. She'd watched the three men bid against each other, watched her father standing at the edge of the crowd unable to meet her eyes, watched the town of Redemption Springs treat her future like entertainment. The bidding had reached 1,500 when the stranger's voice had cut across the square, quiet but carrying, stopping everything. $2,000, the stranger had said, and one bullet. The crowd had turned to look at him. This man nobody knew, standing at the back of the gathering with his hand resting casual on his gun. Porter the auctioneer had frozen, not understanding, not sure if this was a bid or a threat or both. Webb had started to bluster, demanding to know who this stranger thought he was. The stranger had walked forward through the crowd, which had parted like water, and stopped in front of the platform where Emma stood. "I'm offering $2,000 cash for Miss Hartley's basket," the stranger had said, his voice still quiet, but now everyone could hear the steel underneath. and 1 bullet for any man who suggests this auction continues. He'd looked directly at Webb, then Rhodes, then Kane. Your choice, gentlemen. Take the money and walk away, or find out what the bullet costs. The silence that had followed was absolute. Webb's face had gone red, the color of a man unused to being challenged, unused to someone treating his money like it wasn't the final word. I don't know who you are, Webb had started. The stranger had cut him off. I'm someone who spent this morning at the land office, he'd said, discovering that the mineral rights Silas Kane sold you 3 years ago were fraudulent, that the claims you're working actually belong to the territorial government because Kane never properly filed the transfer paperwork, that your entire operation is built on a foundation of forged documents and convenient omissions. Kane's smooth expression had cracked just slightly. That's a serious accusation, he'd said carefully. The stranger had pulled documents from his coat, spread them on the platform. It's a provable fact, he'd said. I've already sent copies to the Territorial Land Commission in Helena. They'll be very interested in how 3 of Montana Territory's wealthiest men built their fortunes on stolen mineral rights. You've got maybe a week before federal agents arrive to shut down your operations and seize your assets pending investigation. Rhodes had stepped forward, hand moving toward his gun. The stranger had been faster, not drawing but ready, the message clear. You really want to make this about speed? The stranger had asked. Because I've already won the part that matters. Your operation is over. Your claims are fraudulent. Your wealth is about to evaporate the moment Helena gets involved. You can walk away now with some dignity. Or you can force this to be bloody and walk away with nothing anyway. The 3 men had looked at each other, done their arithmetic, calculated what they had to lose. Webb had been the first to break. Keep your 2,000, he'd said, his voice tight with rage. This town isn't worth the trouble. He turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him the same way it had parted for the stranger. Rhodes had followed, his cold eyes promising future consequences that would never materialize because his threats only worked when his money backed them up. Kane had lingered the longest, studying the stranger with the kind of calculation that said he was trying to figure out if there was an angle here, a play he'd missed. There wasn't. He'd nodded once, more to himself than anyone else, and walked away with the other 2. The stranger had turned to Emma, still standing on the platform, and pulled $2,000 in territorial notes from his coat. For your father's debt, he'd said, handing the money to Porter, who'd taken it with shaking hands. And for whatever future you decide you want, that doesn't involve being auctioned to men who think money buys people. He'd tipped his hat. Miss Hartley, he'd said. Then he'd walked back through the crowd toward his horse. Emma had found him 20 minutes later at the livery, preparing to ride out like none of it had happened, like he hadn't just destroyed 3 fortunes and ended an auction and handed her back her life. She'd stood in the doorway until he noticed her. Why? She'd asked. You don't know me. You don't know my father. You rode into town this morning, and by afternoon you've made 3 powerful enemies and given away $2,000. Why? The stranger had continued checking his saddle rigging. Because I was in Helena 2 weeks ago, he'd said. Heard about a copper boom town where 3 men were running a scheme on fraudulent mineral rights. Heard they were so confident in their power, they were auctioning off a woman like she was property. Decided that needed addressing. He'd looked at her directly. Your father's debt isn't your responsibility, he'd said, And you're not for sale no matter what Redemption Springs thinks. Those are just facts. Somebody needed to remind everyone. Emma had absorbed this, done her own arithmetic. The $2,000, she'd said, that was real money. The stranger had nodded. Real money for a real debt, he'd said. Your father can pay what he owes without selling you to do it. He'd swung into his saddle. What about you? Emma had asked. You just gave away $2,000 and destroyed your chances of ever doing business in Redemption Springs. What do you get? The stranger had smiled slightly. I get to ride out knowing that 3 men who thought they could buy anything just learned they were wrong, he'd said, and you get to choose your own future. That's worth $2,000 and 1 bullet I didn't have to fire. Robert Hartley had come to find Emma at the livery after the stranger left, carrying the $2,000 Porter had given him with hands that shook. I didn't know, he'd said. I didn't know about the fraudulent claims. I didn't know someone would stop it. I thought this was the only way. Emma had looked at her father, at the shame and relief and confusion on his face. It wasn't the only way, she'd said quietly. It was just the easiest way for you. The way that didn't require you to fight or risk or protect me the way you should have. Her voice hadn't been angry, just tired. Factual. Her father had tried to respond and found he couldn't because she was right, and they both knew it. The federal agents had arrived in Redemption Springs 6 days later, exactly like the stranger had predicted. They'd shut down Webb's smelting operation pending investigation. They'd seized Rhodes's mining claims. They'd arrested Kane for fraud and forgery and a dozen other charges that would keep territorial courts busy for months. The copper boom didn't end, but it reorganized, new operators coming in with proper paperwork, the wealth redistributing to people who'd actually earned mineral rights instead of forging them. Redemption Springs survived, but it survived different, with new rules and new people, and a story about the day 3 barons tried to auction a woman and a stranger paid with a single bullet he never had to fire. Emma Hartley had used part of her father's debt payment to book passage to San Francisco, where she had an aunt and prospects, and a future that didn't involve being auctioned or managed or treated like assets being transferred. She'd left Redemption Springs 3 weeks after the auction, on the morning stage, with enough money to start over and enough anger to make sure she did it right. Her father had tried to apologize at the station. Emma had hugged him because he was still her father, but she'd boarded that stage knowing that some betrayals, even well-intentioned ones, changed relationships permanently. The stranger had ridden north out of Redemption Springs the same day as the auction, heading toward Wyoming or beyond, carrying less money but the same quiet purpose. Somewhere ahead, another town was learning what happened when power went unchecked, when wealth decided it could purchase anything, when someone needed reminding that people aren't property no matter what the ledgers say. The stranger moved toward that next place with the patient certainty of someone who understood that justice sometimes took $2,000 and sometimes took 1 bullet and sometimes took just the credible threat of both. Here's what's worth understanding about the men who changed the frontier. The dangerous ones weren't always the fastest guns or the loudest voices. Sometimes they were the ones who did their homework, who spent a morning in a land office finding the cracks in an empire, who understood that real power comes from knowing where the bodies are buried and being willing to dig them up when necessary. The stranger who'd ended an auction with $2,000 and 1 bullet had done something more devastating than any gunfight could accomplish. He'd destroyed 3 fortunes by exposing the fraud they were built on. He'd returned choice to a woman who'd been treated like inventory. And he'd done it all in 6 hours, with patience and paperwork, and one very clear threat that never had to be executed. 8 towns now. Silver Creek, where speed met strategy. Carson Flats, where mercy met the desert. Whiskey Ridge, where arrogance met accuracy. Redemption Falls, where fear met its ending. Pine Ridge, where a boy found protection. Silverton, where a widow found power. Copper Bend, where humiliation became strategy. And Redemption Springs, where the richest men in town learned that wealth doesn't trump justice when someone's willing to do the work that matters. Tell me something before you go. Where in the world are you hearing this story right now? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this trail reaches. And if you want to keep riding, if you want to know what happens in the next town where power needs checking and people need protecting, the story is waiting for you on the screen right now. Watch it. The sorrel horse moved north through Montana spring morning, carrying a man lighter by $2,000 but heavier with the satisfaction of knowing Emma Hartley was on a stage to San Francisco, and 3 copper barons were explaining to federal agents how their empires were built on fraud. Redemption Springs was reorganizing. The auction was over, and somewhere ahead, because there was always somewhere ahead, another woman was being told her choices weren't her own, and another group of powerful men were confident that money made them untouchable. I'll see you on the trail.